It was supposed to be just another night shift. But as the clock ticked past midnight, something changed. Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Samantha had been a hospice nurse for 5 years, working countless late shifts and comforting patients in their final moments. The job was emotionally taxing, but she found solace in knowing she was helping people cross over peacefully. But nothing could have prepared her for the unsettling events that would unfold during her shift one cold, late night at the hospice. The building had always been old, its long hallways echoing with the sounds of distant footsteps and whispered conversations, though they were often more imagination than reality. The patients who arrived here often didn't leave, but Samantha had become used to the quiet, the almost peaceful stillness that surrounded the place. The only thing that ever seemed to disrupt that calm was the occasional call bell or patient request. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the air was thicker, colder. Samantha couldn't put her finger on it, but something wasn't right. Story Part 1, The First Sign. Samantha pushed her cart down the dimly lit hallway, the faint squeak of its wheels breaking the silence. She had just finished her rounds and was heading to check on Mr. Thomas, an elderly man who had been under her care for the last 2 weeks. He was in his final days, and the hospice had been the right place for him to spend what little time he had left in comfort. His condition had worsened rapidly, and Samantha knew it was only a matter of time. As she approached his room, she noticed that the door was slightly ajar. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes patients wanted a little air or the staff forgot to close the door completely. But tonight it seemed different. A chill ran down her spine as she pushed the door open further. Inside, Mr. Thomas was lying in his bed, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He looked peaceful, as if he were already asleep. But as Samantha took a few steps closer, she froze. His eyes shot open suddenly, wide and glassy, staring directly at her. It wasn't the usual weak gaze she'd grown used to. No, this was something more intense, almost like he was trying to see right through her. "Mr. Thomas?" Samantha asked, trying to mask the unease that had settled in her stomach. She stepped closer, checking his vitals. They were steady, but his gaze never wavered. "You shouldn't be here," Mr. Thomas rasped, his voice barely audible. "She's coming. She'll find you too." Samantha frowned, not sure if he was delirious from his condition or if something else was going on. But as she reached for his hand, a cold wave of air swept over her, sending a shiver down her spine. It wasn't the chill of the room. It was something else entirely, something unnatural. "What do you mean, Mr. Thomas?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite herself. She had heard patients talk about seeing things, but this felt different. He didn't respond at first, his gaze still locked onto her, intense and unblinking. Then, in a whisper that sounded more like a rasp from the very depths of the grave, he spoke again. "She's already in the building. She's waiting." Samantha's blood ran cold. Who was he talking about? Before she could ask further, the room seemed to grow colder. The light above flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And then there was a sound, a soft, distant tapping, like footsteps echoing down the hallway. But when Samantha glanced toward the door, there was no one there. She turned back to Mr. Thomas, her heart racing. His eyes were still fixed on her, and he was muttering something under his breath. "She's coming for you," he whispered again, his voice barely a breath, before he fell silent. Samantha stood there, paralyzed, unsure of what to do. She was trained to comfort patients in their final moments, to ease their fears. But this felt different. Something in the room had changed, and it wasn't just Mr. Thomas's words. It was the air, the very atmosphere around her, thick with an undeniable sense of dread. The tapping sound from the hallway grew louder, closer. Samantha hesitated, then turned to leave, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. But as she reached the door, she froze again. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was a figure. A woman, her face obscured by dark, tangled hair. She stood completely still, staring at Samantha with a cold, unblinking gaze. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. The woman didn't move, didn't make a sound. But her presence was overwhelming. It felt like the air itself had gone still, holding its breath. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. And then the figure stepped backward, disappearing into the shadows. The shadow in the hallway. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, and her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She quickly turned away from Mr. Thomas's room, her mind racing. The strange sense of dread that had settled over her wasn't fading. It was growing stronger with every passing second. She hurried down the hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly against the walls. The tapping sound, which had been faint at first, now seemed to follow her. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, she thought she saw a shadow flitting just out of view. But when she turned around fully, there was nothing there. Her hand tightened around the medical cart she was pushing. She had to make her rounds. It was her responsibility, after all. She needed to check on the other patients. But as she moved through the corridor, the silence felt suffocating. There was a heavy air about the place, and she could almost feel eyes watching her from the darkness. Passing by the empty rooms, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hospice wasn't empty. There were patients in nearly every room, but there was an unsettling emptiness in the air, a feeling that she was being watched. Finally, she reached Mrs. Hargrove's room, the next on her list. The elderly woman had been in hospice for nearly a month now, and while her body was frail, her mind was sharp. As Samantha stepped inside, she immediately noticed something strange. The room was darker than usual, and there was a thick, oppressive stillness hanging in the air. "Mrs. Hargrove?" Samantha called gently. No response. Samantha walked closer, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She could see the old woman lying in her bed, staring at the ceiling with wide, unblinking eyes. Her breathing was slow, steady, almost too steady. It was as though she was in some sort of trance. "Mrs. Hargrove?" Samantha repeated, her voice trembling this time. "Are you okay?" The woman didn't move. But then, in a voice so faint it barely reached Samantha's ears, Mrs. Hargrove whispered, "She's coming for you too." Samantha froze. She had heard similar phrases before, from other patients nearing the end of their lives. Sometimes they mumbled things in their delirium, things that didn't make sense. But this felt different. "What do you mean?" Samantha asked, kneeling beside the bed. She reached out and gently placed her hand on Mrs. Hargrove's. It was cold, like ice. The old woman's lips barely parted as she spoke again, but this time her words sent a chill running down Samantha's spine. "The shadow," Mrs. Hargrove rasped. "It's waiting in the hallway. It watches you. It knows when you're here." Samantha felt her stomach twist. She had to leave. This was too much. But before she could stand up, she felt it, a cold breeze sweeping through the room, chilling her to the bone. The lights above flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. And then she heard it. The tapping sound, louder this time, like the footsteps of something moving closer. She stood abruptly, her heart racing. She turned toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, she froze. A figure stood in the doorway. A woman. Tall, pale, with long, dark hair that hung in loose strands around her face. Her eyes were empty, hollow, black as the darkest night. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her body refused to move, as if frozen in place by some unseen force. The woman didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her presence filled the room with a suffocating energy, an overwhelming force that made Samantha feel as if she might collapse at any moment. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, the woman was gone. The door was empty again, but the coldness remained, lingering in the air like a heavy fog. Samantha stood there for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. What in the world was happening? Was she seeing things? Was she just exhausted, her mind playing tricks on her after a long night? But she knew deep down that this wasn't just her imagination. She could feel it in her bones. Something dark, something terrifying, was lurking in the hallways of the hospice. The dark presence. Samantha's pulse raced as she stepped out of Mrs. Hargrove's room. Her mind was whirling with confusion and fear. The eerie woman in the doorway, was she real? Or was it some twisted manifestation brought on by exhaustion? She didn't know what to believe anymore. All she knew was that the oppressive silence in the hospice had taken on a whole new meaning. She gripped the medical cart tightly, her knuckles white from the pressure. The cold air that had filled the room still clung to her skin, making her shiver uncontrollably. As she hurried down the hallway, her footsteps quickened, a desperate need to get away from the unsettling presence that now felt more real than ever. Her mind was racing as she passed the rooms, each one seeming more suffocating than the last. The faint sounds of the other patients' labored breaths, the steady beep of the machines, all of it had turned into a constant reminder of the dark force that seemed to be lurking just beyond her sight. She could feel eyes on her, but whenever she glanced over her shoulder, there was nothing there. The further she walked, the more the air grew thick and heavy. It was like the building itself was alive, breathing in sync with her, feeding on her fear. Samantha paused at the end of the hallway, trying to steady herself. She needed to focus. She needed to stay calm. But the feeling of being watched only intensified. And then a voice, barely a whisper, slipped into her ear. "Don't go any further." Samantha spun around, her heart skipping a beat. There was no one there. Not a soul in sight. She was alone. Or was she? The voice came again, this time from down the hallway. It was unmistakable, the voice of someone familiar. Someone who had passed away weeks ago. "Turn back, Samantha. It's not safe." Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized that voice. It was Mrs. Hargrove. But she had just left her room. How could she be speaking to her now? Samantha took a step back, her legs feeling weak beneath her. Her head swam with disbelief, and yet the sensation that something was horribly wrong was undeniable. She took another step back, then another. She needed to leave, to escape this nightmare. But before she could turn to flee, a figure appeared at the far end of the hallway. A shadow. Just a flicker at first, but then it solidified into something more. Something solid, something real. A tall, gaunt figure, its face obscured by darkness. The air seemed to pulse with a life of its own, vibrating with an unnatural energy. Samantha froze. The figure didn't move at first, just standing there, watching her. She felt her breath catch in her throat, her body frozen in fear. Then it stepped forward. Each step echoed in the silence, a sound that sent chills down her spine. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring her fear. Samantha took a shaky step backward, her feet feeling like lead. The shadow's presence felt oppressive, like it was suffocating the very air around her. The temperature dropped even further. Her breath came out in small, visible puffs of steam, and her teeth began to chatter involuntarily. The figure continued to advance, and with each step, the hallway grew darker. The lights flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls like they were alive. And then the figure spoke. "Leave this place, or you will become like us." The voice was cold, lifeless, like it had come from the deepest part of the earth. It had no warmth, no humanity. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that the shadow wasn't just a hallucination. It was real. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting for someone like her. "Who are you?" Samantha's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Her legs trembled, and she clutched the cart in a desperate attempt to steady herself. "What do you want from me?" The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it reached out, its hand stretching toward her, long fingers that seemed to elongate unnaturally as they moved closer. In a panic, Samantha spun on her heels and fled down the hall. The sound of the figure's footsteps chasing her echoed in her ears, growing louder with every passing second. She had to get to the exit. She had to get out of the building. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was run. She reached the nurse's station and slammed her hand against the button for the elevator, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. The elevator was on the 3rd floor, but it seemed like an eternity before it finally arrived. The doors slid open with an eerie, creaking sound, and Samantha stumbled inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the elevator descended, she closed her eyes, trying to calm herself, trying to make sense of everything. But when the doors opened, she was met with a sight that nearly made her heart stop. The hallway was empty. Too empty. It was as if nothing had happened. The lights were on, the air was normal again, and the faint hum of the building's systems resumed. But the sense of wrongness still lingered in the pit of her stomach. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Or was something far more sinister at play? She stepped out into the quiet hallway, every step echoing in the silence. The elevator doors closed behind her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She turned down the hall toward the front door, but before she could take another step, the voice returned. "Get out, Samantha." It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a scream. A piercing, gut-wrenching scream that came from the very walls themselves. The sound rattled her bones, and she turned in horror. And there, standing at the far end of the hallway, was the shadow. Waiting. The endless hallway. Samantha stood frozen at the entrance of the hallway, her eyes locked on the dark figure that loomed in the distance. The air around her had become unbearably heavy, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Her breath hitched in her chest, and her pulse thudded painfully in her ears. She couldn't look away from the shadow. It was as if it had its hold on her, pulling her in, making it impossible to escape. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the distance between her and the figure expanding with every second that passed. She had no idea what it was, but she could feel its malice. The temperature dropped even further, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. The lights above flickered, their once steady glow now erratic and unpredictable. The shadow didn't move. It didn't need to. It was waiting for her, watching her. And the fear that filled Samantha's chest began to grow, suffocating her. Her throat tightened, and she struggled to swallow. The words Mrs. Hargrove had spoken echoed in her mind. It watches you. It knows when you're here. Samantha shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away, but they wouldn't leave. She couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the doorway, the coldness in the air, the way her hand had frozen against the wall. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything that had happened so far had been leading up to this moment. "Get out, Samantha." The voice came again, this time more distorted, more guttural. It reverberated through the walls, sending a chill down her spine. Her legs felt weak, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. She took a tentative step backward, then another, but the shadow's presence seemed to draw her forward. She couldn't move. Her eyes darted to the exit, the only way out of this nightmare, but it felt as if the hallway stretched on forever. The door seemed so far away, as though the distance between her and freedom had grown exponentially. She couldn't get any closer. It was like the hallway was alive, twisting and turning, mocking her every attempt to escape. Her mind raced. The air in the hallway felt suffocating. There was something wrong with the hospice. Something ancient, something unnatural. What had happened to the patients here? What had happened to the staff? Were they all trapped in this nightmare too? Suddenly, the lights above her flickered one last time, plunging the hallway into darkness. A gut-wrenching, metallic sound echoed through the silence, the creaking of old wood groaning in protest. Samantha could barely breathe, the weight of the darkness pressing against her chest. The shadow moved. For a split second, the figure was no longer in the distance. It was closer, so much closer. Samantha's heart lurched in her chest as the figure seemed to melt out of the shadows, its face coming into view, if only for a moment. The woman's eyes were hollow, empty pits of blackness that seemed to swallow the light itself. Her skin was pale, like death itself had claimed her. But it was her expression that truly horrified Samantha. A twisted, grotesque smile that seemed to stretch far too wide, stretching across the woman's face in a sickeningly unnatural way. The shadow reached out with one long, gnarled hand. Samantha recoiled, but the air around her felt thick, like she was stuck in place. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her body refused to obey. The woman's voice cut through the silence once more, a rasping, almost whispering tone that chilled Samantha to her core. "Why did you come back, Samantha? You shouldn't have come." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as the woman's hand reached for her. Samantha fought to move, but it felt as though invisible chains had bound her to the spot. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and quick, but the darkness around her seemed to smother the sound. And then, like a dam breaking, the world around her seemed to shift. The walls warped, twisting into something otherworldly. The hospice, which had once been a familiar, if quiet place, now felt like an alien landscape, one she couldn't recognize, no matter how many times she had walked its halls. The shadow grew, expanding outward until it was no longer just one figure. It was many. Faces, sickly, contorted faces, emerged from the walls, their eyes wide and unblinking. The whispers began, voices overlapping in a maddening cacophony. "You shouldn't have stayed. You will never leave. They're all waiting for you." The faces seemed to leer at her, their expressions twisted in agony and anger. And in the midst of it all, the woman, the shadow, stood at the center, her smile still stretched wide, as if she were watching Samantha's suffering with morbid pleasure. Samantha screamed, her voice hoarse as she tried to run, tried to escape. But it was like the walls themselves were closing in on her, the air growing thick and suffocating. She stumbled backward, her eyes darting around for any kind of escape, but there was nothing. No doors, no windows, no way out. Her mind spun as the whispers became louder, more frantic. The faces moved closer, their hollow eyes following her every move, their hands reaching for her. She was surrounded, trapped, with no hope of escape. And then she felt it, a cold hand on her shoulder. Samantha whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat. There was no one there. But the touch, the coldness of it, the unmistakable sensation of fingers brushing against her skin, it was real. She could feel it. She could feel the breath on the back of her neck, cold and clammy, like the touch of death itself. The shadow was right behind her. The shadows that follow. Samantha's heart raced, the cold hand on her shoulder feeling like an anchor pulling her deeper into the abyss of terror. She spun around, expecting to find the figure standing right there, but the hallway was empty. The air was suffocating, the walls pressing in on her from all sides, as if the very building was alive, aware of her every move. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale creating clouds of mist in the frigid air. The shadows on the walls flickered, alive with a malevolent energy. The faces that had emerged from the darkness were gone, but Samantha could still hear their whispers, echoing in her mind, gnawing at her sanity. Their voices were inescapable, impossible to ignore. "You should have left. You shouldn't have come back. They're all waiting." The words coiled around her thoughts, feeding the growing sense of dread that gripped her. She couldn't tell what was real anymore. Was this all in her head? Was she imagining the dark figures, the whispers, the cold touch? Or was something far worse at play? Her hand instinctively reached for her phone, the one thing that had grounded her during these moments of horror. But when she looked down, the screen was shattered. The device was useless. Her chest tightened, and a wave of panic threatened to overwhelm her. "I need to get out," she whispered to herself, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't stay here. Not with whatever was haunting this place. Whatever it was, whatever they were, she needed to leave. But the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the door at the end nowhere in sight. It felt like time itself had warped, each step taking her further into the void, further away from the safety of the world she knew. She stumbled forward, her feet dragging against the cold, uneven floor. The dim light above flickered again, and she felt her nerves fraying with each passing second. The hallway seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, as if the building itself were alive, aware of her every movement, feeding off her fear. As she walked, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her, light but unmistakable. They grew louder with each step she took. It was impossible. She was alone, wasn't she? The shadows that lurked in the corners of her vision seemed to twist and stretch, as if they were following her every movement. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She turned sharply, her pulse spiking. No one was there, but the footsteps continued, as if something, or someone, was just out of her line of sight, stalking her from the shadows. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move, to keep walking, hoping that if she just kept going, if she just kept putting one foot in front of the other, she might eventually find a way out. But the more she moved, the longer the hallway seemed to become. The walls closed in on her, the air growing colder, denser, heavier. And then she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, its form indistinct at first, like a mere silhouette. But as it stepped forward, the details became clearer. The figure was wearing a long, tattered hospital gown, its face hidden in the folds of shadow. Its hands were unnaturally long, fingers stretching like thin, gnarled branches reaching out toward her. Samantha froze, her breath catching in her throat. She knew she should run. She knew that staying in this cursed hallway was a death sentence. But her body refused to obey her commands. She was rooted to the spot, staring at the figure, her eyes wide with terror. And then it spoke. Its voice was raspy, like the sound of dry leaves scraping against the ground, hollow and distorted. "You shouldn't have come back, Samantha. You're already too late." The words hit her like a physical blow. Too late. What did it mean? Was this the truth behind the walls? The words from the figure echoed in Samantha's mind, reverberating with a chilling finality. You're already too late. The dread that had been building inside her now twisted into something darker, something suffocating. Her legs trembled beneath her, but her body still refused to move, as if some unseen force had paralyzed her. The figure stepped closer, its long, skeletal fingers reaching out as if to pull her into the depths of the shadowy abyss. Samantha's breath quickened, her pulse pounding in her ears, but she couldn't look away. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but she couldn't tear herself from the figure's presence, its haunting words still swirling in her mind. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure repeated, its voice a distorted whisper that crawled beneath her skin. Samantha's eyes flitted around, searching for any escape, but there was nothing. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, an endless expanse of darkened walls and flickering lights. She could hear the whispers again, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. They came from all around her, like a swarm of voices filling the space, each one as desperate as the last. She took a step back, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw a figure at the corner of her vision, a woman pale and gaunt, standing motionless in the shadows. Her face was familiar, though twisted by the grim light, her eyes empty, devoid of life. Mrs. Hargrove. Samantha's heart clenched. The woman who had worked at the hospice, who had warned her, who had begged her to leave. But now, Mrs. Hargrove wasn't standing in front of her. She was part of the darkness, an eerie figure in the background, her presence just as much a part of this haunting reality as the shadows that engulfed the hallway. Samantha turned back to the figure before her, its face now fully visible, though its features were distorted and warped, twisted in a grotesque smile that made her skin crawl. The gown it wore was tattered, stained with an unidentifiable dark substance, its fabric hanging in strips. But its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were fixed on her, and that gaze pierced into her very soul. "You're not meant to be here, Samantha," the figure rasped, its voice gaining strength. "This place, this hospice, is not what you think it is." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. What was it talking about? Was this some kind of twisted nightmare? Could she still wake up from this? She reached for her phone again, desperate to call for help, but the device remained broken in her hand, the shattered screen reflecting nothing but her panic-stricken face. The figure raised one bony hand, pointing toward the farthest corner of the hallway. A door stood there, cracked open just slightly. But even as Samantha looked at it, she could feel a sickening presence coming from beyond the threshold. It felt wrong, unnatural. "The truth is beyond that door," the figure said, its voice now thick with malice. "But beware, Samantha. What you find there will change everything you know." Samantha didn't know how she found the strength to move, but her legs finally obeyed her. She took a step forward, then another, her eyes never leaving the figure. She was drawn to the door, her heart thundering in her chest, each step echoing like a drumbeat of doom. She reached the door, hesitating only for a moment before she pushed it open. The air behind it was stale and thick with the scent of decay, but Samantha couldn't stop now. She stepped inside, the darkness swallowing her whole. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small flickering lamp in the corner. The walls were lined with shelves, old medical equipment, and rusted tools. But what caught her attention was the far wall. A mirror, large and imposing, hung there, its surface cracked and covered with a thick layer of dust. Samantha stepped closer, her reflection barely visible in the glass. As she reached out to wipe away the grime, she felt a chill run down her spine. Something wasn't right. The reflection in the mirror seemed to move, distorting in ways that her own body did not. She stumbled back, horrified. The figure from the hallway appeared behind her in the mirror, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Its smile was wide and menacing, stretching beyond human limits, as if its face had been carved into a permanent expression of grotesque joy. "It's too late to leave," it whispered from the reflection, its voice cold and taunting. Samantha turned away from the mirror, her stomach churning. But as she did, she saw something that froze her blood, a shadow creeping across the floor, slowly, deliberately. It was not a normal shadow. This one was moving, crawling toward her like a living thing. She backed up, her breath coming in quick gasps, but the shadow followed, growing larger with each passing second. The walls began to close in around her, the room growing smaller, the air growing heavier. Panic surged within her. She tried to move, to run, but her legs refused to obey. The shadow grew taller, until it towered over her, its form twisting and shifting into a monstrous shape. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The shadow's form solidified, revealing a twisted figure, an amalgamation of shadows and broken faces. A hand shot out from the darkness, its fingers cold and skeletal, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the mirror. "You should never have come back," the voice from the mirror echoed, the words now a chorus of twisted voices. "Now you belong to us." Samantha's body fought against the pull, but it was no use. The shadow was too strong. It dragged her closer to the mirror, and as she struggled, she could feel the cold surface of the glass pressing against her skin. Her reflection, the reflection, reached out, its hand mirroring the shadow's movements. It was no longer her own face she saw staring back at her. It was Mrs. Hargrove. Her pale, lifeless eyes met Samantha's, and the woman's mouth twisted into a chilling grin. "You belong to this place now," Mrs. Hargrove's voice whispered. "Forever." And then the world around Samantha shattered. The mirror's curse. The world around Samantha cracked open like shattered glass, and for a brief moment, she felt weightless, like she was floating through the cold abyss of space, unable to breathe, unable to move. Her mind spun, and everything she thought she knew was slipping away, dissolving into the nothingness of that moment. The mirror's cold grip held her, pulling her deeper into its cursed reflection. For a second, she thought she would be lost forever in that space. But suddenly, her vision returned, her eyes snapping open to the cold, stark reality of the room. The oppressive darkness of the hospice surrounded her, but now it felt different. It wasn't just the gloom and shadows. It was the feeling that she was no longer alone, not in the way she had been moments before. The reflection in the mirror was gone. Samantha blinked, her breath catching in her throat as she slowly looked around. She could feel it now, the weight of invisible eyes on her, watching her every movement. The shadows seemed to twist, as though they were alive, shifting and waiting for her next move. The walls were closing in again, though this time they felt more suffocating, more alive with the whispers that echoed from every corner. She tried to move toward the door, but something held her back. A deep, guttural voice seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, curling around her mind like tendrils of darkness. "You cannot leave. Not now. Not ever." The words felt like they were carved into her very soul, freezing her in place. The fear gripped her tighter, her legs refusing to cooperate. The door behind her seemed to grow more distant with each passing moment, as if it was slipping further away, unreachable. Her hands trembled as she tried to steady herself against the cold, cracked wall. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, growing like sentient beings, reaching toward her with malevolent intent. "I have to get out," Samantha thought desperately, but her mind seemed fogged with dread, clouded by the suffocating weight of the darkness around her. She could barely think, her thoughts fragmented, lost in the chaos that was now her world. A movement caught her eye. A figure, barely discernible in the corner, just beyond the edge of the flickering light. It was still, almost too still, but there was something about it that made Samantha's skin crawl. It wasn't like the others. This one was different, almost human. It stood in the darkness, its outline barely visible against the shadows. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. She could barely make out the details, but the figure seemed to be watching her, waiting. Its presence was cold, too cold, and the longer she stared at it, the more she felt its gaze sink into her skin, burning her with an unspoken horror. She couldn't tear her eyes away from it, even as her entire body screamed for her to run. It began to move slowly, its steps unnaturally quiet, gliding over the floor like a shadow itself. As it drew closer, Samantha could make out more details. Its skin was pale, sickly, stretched thin over its bones. Its eyes were wide and hollow, dark pools of emptiness that seemed to stare straight through her. The figure was gaunt, its fingers long and twisted, like claws that scraped against the floor with every step. She tried to move, tried to break free from the paralysis that had taken over her body, but it was impossible. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, pressing against her lungs, making it harder to breathe. "You can't escape," the voice came again, this time directly from the figure. It spoke softly, but the words were laced with venom, each one echoing with an almost hypnotic power. Samantha could feel it. The figure was not just speaking to her, it was speaking inside her. Its voice crawled through her thoughts, its words sinking deep into her mind, like a parasite gnawing at her sanity. She tried to scream, to force herself to move, but her voice was trapped, stuck in her throat. It was as if the figure had stolen her ability to speak, to act. She was trapped in her own body, a prisoner of this forsaken place. The figure stopped right in front of her. It loomed over her, casting a long shadow that swallowed her whole. Its breath was icy, brushing against her skin like a cold wind, sending a shiver down her spine. "You were warned," the figure whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "You should have listened. You were never meant to return. You were never meant to know the truth." Samantha's chest tightened with fear, but she fought against the cold grip that held her. She had to know. She had to understand what was happening, what this place was, and why it was happening to her. What truth? She wanted to scream. "What did you mean?" But her mouth remained sealed, her body frozen in place. The figure's eyes, though, were enough to tell her everything she needed to know. They were filled with a sorrow that was almost unbearable, a sorrow that bled into something darker, something twisted. It wasn't just the face of an apparition. It was the face of someone who had been wronged, someone who had been trapped in the same prison Samantha now found herself in. "You are part of it now," the figure murmured, its words a curse. "The mirror was only the beginning. The truth is far darker than you realize." Suddenly, the figure's face contorted, its mouth stretching open in a grotesque grin. The darkness around them surged, twisting into horrific shapes that seemed to writhe and stretch like living nightmares. The walls groaned, and the shadows themselves seemed to scream. "You'll never leave. None of us will." With that, the figure lunged forward, its hands reaching out, long claws scraping toward Samantha's face. She tried to move, but it was too late. The figure's fingers wrapped around her throat, cold and tight, as the darkness overwhelmed her vision. Everything went black. Descent into darkness. When Samantha regained consciousness, the first thing she felt was the cold. It wasn't the biting chill of winter or the uncomfortable draft of an old building. It was a suffocating cold, the kind that numbed her bones, making her feel as if she were submerged in ice. She blinked her eyes open, her vision blurry at first, like a foggy window slowly clearing. The darkness around her felt heavy, as though it had substance, pressing in from every side, threatening to crush her. She gasped for air, her breath ragged and shallow. The weight on her chest made it hard to breathe, as though the very atmosphere was dense and crushing. As her senses returned to her, she became acutely aware of her surroundings, or rather, the lack of surroundings. The hospice room, the hallway, the mirror, they were all gone. Instead, she was lying on the cold, stone floor, her hands pressed into the rough surface beneath her. Her body felt numb, her limbs stiff from the cold and the lingering fear. She pushed herself up, her hands trembling as she braced against the floor. The room was dimly lit by a faint, flickering light from somewhere deep within the darkness. Shadows seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, stretching and shifting like they were alive, watching her every move. The place she had woken in was unfamiliar, like nothing she had ever seen before. The walls were jagged and uneven, as though the building had been constructed in haste or had simply deteriorated over the years. There were no windows, no doors, only cold stone and oppressive silence. It felt like being trapped inside a tomb, a place forgotten by time. A place where no one would ever find her. How did I get here? Samantha thought, panic beginning to rise in her chest once more. Her heart thudded in her ears, the rhythmic pulse of fear building as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. The air around her was thick, the kind of air that makes your skin crawl, filled with an oppressive energy that made her feel small, insignificant. The darkness had a presence, something that lurked just out of sight, waiting, hungry. The silence was deafening. For a long moment, she was unsure if she was even breathing or if the suffocating atmosphere had taken that away from her, too. Then a sound. Faint but unmistakable. A whisper. Her heart skipped in her chest. She jerked her head toward the source of the sound, her breath catching in her throat. It came from the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to move more erratically, swirling and twisting. "Samantha." The voice was soft at first, like a breeze caressing her ear, but as the name echoed in the darkness, it grew louder, more insistent. "Samantha, come closer." Her blood ran cold. She didn't know what it was, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human. It couldn't be. But despite the terror that gripped her, something inside her urged her forward. Her feet moved almost of their own accord, as though they were being pulled toward the voice, drawn to it by an invisible force. "Come closer," the voice repeated, now louder, sharper. It was a command, but it didn't feel like one. It felt like a plea, a cry for help, yet at the same time, something insidious, something darker, lingered in its tone. Samantha tried to resist, but her body betrayed her, pulling her forward step by step, the cold stone floor beneath her feet echoing with each movement. She felt like a puppet on strings, every fiber of her being screaming to stop, but her legs continued to carry her toward the voice. As she reached the corner of the room, the whispering stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. The shadows seemed to part, revealing what lay beyond. It was a mirror, tall and narrow, its surface cracked and shattered, as though it had been broken into 1,000 pieces long ago and then hastily put back together. The edges of the mirror were dark, smeared with something black and sticky, like oil or tar. Samantha's breath hitched in her throat. She didn't want to look into it. She knew it was wrong. She knew it would be dangerous, that it would pull her in, just like the one in the hospice. But something about it felt familiar, as if it was calling her, beckoning her to look into its depths. Her eyes betrayed her. Despite every instinct in her body telling her to turn away, her gaze locked onto the mirror. At first, there was nothing, just the shattered reflection of the dim room around her. But then, slowly, the surface of the mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a drop. Her reflection started to shift, distort. The shadows within the glass began to move, swirling around her image, twisting it, contorting it into something else. Samantha's breath caught in her chest. Her own reflection smiled at her, a twisted, grotesque smile that stretched wider and wider until it was impossible to ignore. Her own face, contorted with an evil grin, stared back at her with empty, hollow eyes. The image in the mirror wasn't her anymore. It was something other. And that's when the voice returned louder, more insistent than before. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, the sound so chilling it made her skin crawl. "This place is where the forgotten ones are kept. The ones who don't belong anywhere else." Samantha stumbled back, her heart racing as panic set in. She wanted to scream, to run, but the air around her was thick and heavy, as if the very space itself was pulling her closer to the mirror. She tried to look away, but her eyes wouldn't move. They were locked on the reflection, her twisted self grinning at her with unnatural glee. The darkness in the mirror began to reach out, tendrils of shadow stretching toward her, grasping at her clothes, her skin. A voice, no, her voice, whispered from within her own reflection. "You were always meant to be here, Samantha. You just didn't know it yet." The shadows closed in around her, the darkness suffocating. And then the mirror's surface cracked wide open, its broken edges reaching out, tearing at her reality, pulling her into its endless void. The depths of despair. The moment Samantha's body was pulled into the mirror, she felt as though she were falling, weightless, trapped in a black void. There was no sound, no air, just the oppressive sensation of descending deeper and deeper into something that defied all sense of time or space. It felt like eternity in that split second, an endless descent with no end in sight. And then suddenly everything stopped. She hit the ground hard, her body colliding with cold, unforgiving stone. The shock of impact sent a jolt through her, making her head spin and her body ache, but there was no time to process the pain. The moment she pushed herself up, she realized she was no longer in the room with the broken mirror. The air was thick here, still, heavy with an unsettling silence that pressed in from all sides. The atmosphere felt wrong, as though the very world around her was decaying, rotting from the inside out. She tried to breathe, but the air felt thick in her lungs, like she was inhaling something tainted, something foul. The darkness around her stretched endlessly in every direction, consuming everything. She couldn't see, couldn't feel anything beyond the blackness that surrounded her like a blanket. Her heart hammered in her chest. She tried to move, but every step seemed to take her nowhere, as though the ground beneath her was shifting, making the very act of walking feel like a struggle. Her senses were on high alert, her body tense, every nerve screaming to escape, but there was nowhere to run. And then the whispers came again. They were faint at first, like a distant murmur, but they grew louder, closer, more insistent. The voices were indistinct, overlapping, creating a cacophony of sound that echoed in her ears. Some were guttural, others soft, almost like a lullaby, but all of them carried the same dark weight, the kind of weight that pressed down on your chest, suffocating you with its presence. "Samantha!" The whispering voice from earlier, the one that had beckoned her to the mirror, pierced through the noise. It was louder now, clearer, but still unmistakably eerie, still laced with malice. "You shouldn't be here. None of you should be here." The cold, guttural voice echoed in her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like chains. She wanted to scream, wanted to call out, but something in the air was preventing her. It was as if the very place itself was feeding on her fear, amplifying it, using it to control her, to keep her trapped in its clutches. She staggered forward, trying to ignore the whispers that clawed at her sanity. Each step seemed to take her deeper into the darkness, further from any sense of reality. The silence between the whispers was deafening, and the weight of isolation began to gnaw at her. The fear, the panic, the feeling of being utterly alone in this vast, oppressive space, it was all-consuming. "Samantha!" The voice spoke again, this time coming from directly behind her, sending a chill down her spine. "You're already too late." She whirled around, heart pounding in her chest, but there was nothing but the suffocating darkness pressing in around her. There was no escape, no light, no hint of salvation. The oppressive silence was broken only by the voices, now louder and more desperate. "You've come here of your own free will," the voice continued, growing darker, more twisted. "You've crossed into our world. And now you'll stay here, just like the rest of them." Samantha's breath hitched in her throat. The rest of them? Before she could process what that meant, something shifted in the darkness before her. Something moved. It was a shadow at first, indistinct, but then it began to take shape. She could see it now, a figure, hunched and twisted, its form bathed in the same unnatural darkness that surrounded her. The figure was humanoid, but its proportions were off. Too long, too gaunt, its limbs elongated in ways that made it look more like a marionette than a person. The figure's face was obscured by the darkness, but its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, glowing faintly in the void. And as it slowly stepped forward, Samantha could hear the faintest sound, scraping, like claws dragging across stone. "Don't worry, Samantha," the voice cooed again, now clearly emanating from the figure itself. "We're not here to hurt you. Not yet, anyway." Samantha took an instinctual step back, her heart racing as she backed away from the creature. Her mind screamed at her to run, but she knew there was nowhere to go. The shadows seemed to close in around her, trapping her in this nightmare of darkness and whispers. "You're already part of the collection," the figure continued, its voice dripping with a twisted sense of amusement. "All those who come here are. We keep them. We watch them. We never let them leave." Her chest tightened in terror. This place wasn't just a void. It was a prison, an eternal prison, and she had unwittingly walked straight into its grasp. Samantha could feel the weight of the creature's eyes on her, the tension in the air thickening with every passing second. It moved closer, its limbs dragging behind it like the remnants of a broken puppet, and its eyes never left her, glowing brighter with each step. "You will join them," the voice whispered, its tone shifting from calm to something more sinister. "You will become part of the darkness, just like the rest of us." Her panic flared, and she tried to turn away, but the darkness seemed to reach out, closing around her, pulling her back. The creature's hand, if it could even be called a hand, shot forward, its fingers long and spindly, like claws, gripping her arm with an unnatural strength. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, absorbed into the suffocating silence. And then, as if the very walls of the dark world had heard her cry, the voice grew louder, more frantic, more desperate. "Samantha, you don't belong here." The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated through the stone, through her very bones. She was falling again, only this time, she didn't know where she was falling to. The darkness swallowed her whole, and she couldn't escape it. The collection had claimed her. The final descent. Samantha's scream echoed in her mind as the world around her continued to crumble. She was no longer aware of her body, no longer aware of the ground beneath her feet. It was as if the very fabric of reality had unraveled, leaving her in a space where nothing made sense. She felt weightless, as though she were floating in an endless void, drifting through darkness that consumed every trace of light. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear, panic, and confusion. The creature's hand was still gripping her, its claws digging into her skin, drawing blood. She felt the cold, unrelenting chill of its touch, as though it were sucking the warmth from her very being. But as it pulled her closer, the darkness seemed to shift again, coiling around her like an unholy serpent, constricting her lungs, suffocating her thoughts. And then, in the midst of the oppressive silence, the whispers began anew, this time louder, more frantic, more urgent. It was as if the very darkness itself had come alive, communicating with her in a language she couldn't comprehend. The voices were overlapping, some too distorted to understand, others too clear, each one pulling her in different directions, each one adding another layer of fear to her already fragile mind. "Samantha! Samantha!" they called, the name slipping in and out of her consciousness, each time with more desperation. "You don't belong here. You can't be one of us." The voice from earlier, the one that had called her name in the mirror, spoke again, its tone strangely comforting, but there was a coldness to it now, a harsh edge that made her shiver. "It's too late," it whispered. "You can't leave. You've already crossed the threshold." Samantha's heart thundered in her chest. She could hear it, feel it, each beat a reminder of the life she was desperately clinging to. She wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but her voice was lost in the suffocating darkness. There was nothing she could do. She was powerless. The creature's grip tightened, its claws sinking deeper into her skin, and she winced, the pain sharp and real. But it wasn't just the physical pain that tormented her. It was the feeling of her very soul being dragged deeper into this cursed world. A world where time had no meaning, and nothing was ever truly alive. The darkness around her shifted again, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of light, far, far in the distance. Hope surged within her, but it was fleeting, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. She reached out, desperate to grasp it, but the darkness swallowed it whole. "No!" she whispered to herself, shaking her head. I can't stay here. I can't. The whispers grew louder, more distorted. Her mind felt as if it were splitting apart, each voice tearing at her sanity. The voices weren't just words, they were thoughts, emotions, memories, her own memories. She could hear fragments of her past, fragments of the life she had left behind. Her family, her friends, the people she loved, all calling out to her, telling her that they were waiting for her, telling her that they needed her. But their voices were fading, replaced by the cold, hollow tones of the creature and the dark whispers that filled her mind. You can't escape, the creature hissed, its voice now sounding more like a growl. There's no way out. You are ours now. You will never be free again. The darkness around her pulsed, each beat like a wave crashing against her, pushing her further into despair. She could feel her energy draining, her will to fight slipping away. She couldn't even tell if she was still standing, still breathing, or if she had already crossed into some dark, twisted version of reality. And then, in the distance, she saw it again, another flicker of light, faint but undeniable. This time, it didn't vanish. It grew brighter, closer, as though something was fighting to reach her, to pull her away from the grip of the darkness. It was a memory of her family. She could see her mother's face, her father's arms reaching out to her. They were calling her name, their voices filled with warmth, with love. Samantha's heart twisted in pain as she realized how far she had fallen from that life. The love they had given her, the safety they had offered, it was all so far away now. She reached out again, this time with everything she had left. She could feel the light pulling her, guiding her through the endless void, through the suffocating blackness that threatened to swallow her whole. But the creature's grip tightened again, its claws sinking deeper into her flesh. The voices swirled around her, louder now, more insistent, like a storm of chaos that battered her mind. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. You can't leave, the creature snarled, its voice no longer cold but filled with rage. You belong to us now. You will be one of us. Forever. Samantha could feel the darkness trying to claim her, trying to erase every trace of the life she had once known. It was trying to pull her into its endless night, to erase her memories, her humanity. She could feel herself slipping away, becoming just another lost soul in the collection of darkness. But then a surge of willpower coursed through her, as if something deep within her was fighting back. She couldn't let it win. She couldn't. The light grew brighter, and this time, she didn't hesitate. She reached for it, her hand trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. The darkness screamed, howling with rage, but Samantha wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't going to let it take her. Not without a fight. With one final, desperate cry, she broke free. The world around her shattered, the darkness splintering into a million pieces as the light engulfed her, pulling her away from the nightmare, away from the creature, away from the prison of the cursed world. But as the light surrounded her, she heard one final whisper, cold and mocking, from the depths of the darkness. This is not over, Samantha. You can never truly escape. And then everything went silent. The final awakening. Samantha's eyes snapped open. She gasped for air, her chest rising and falling in rapid succession, as though she had just emerged from a suffocating nightmare. For a moment, everything around her seemed disoriented, blurry, like she was trapped between two worlds. The air felt thick, heavy with a sense of unease, as though something was still lurking in the shadows. She sat up, her heart hammering in her chest. She was back in the hospice room, the same sterile environment, the same cold walls. Her hands trembled as she reached out, feeling the soft fabric of the sheets, the steady hum of the machines beside her. It was all so real, so familiar. Was it all just a dream? She wondered. But then the memories flooded back, the creatures, the darkness, the whispers, the terror. The relentless, suffocating presence that had tried to claim her. She could still feel the coldness of its touch, still hear the growls, the haunting words. You can never truly escape, the voice had said. Samantha shuddered as the words echoed in her mind. They weren't just words. They were a warning, a promise that no matter how far she ran, the darkness would always find her. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything unusual. The dim light from the lamp on the table cast long shadows on the walls, but nothing was out of place. There was no creature, no monster lurking in the corners. The hospice was still, the only sound being the rhythmic beeping of the machines. But something felt off. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, trying to convince herself that she was safe. It was over. She had escaped. She had fought back. The darkness was behind her. right? The door to the room opened slowly, and a nurse stepped inside, her soft footsteps echoing in the silence. Samantha's heart skipped a beat as she looked up, her eyes searching for any sign of the creature. But the nurse was just a woman in her early 30s, with a kind smile and a gentle demeanor. "Good morning, Samantha," the nurse said, her voice calm and reassuring. "How are you feeling?" Samantha swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her throat was dry, constricted, as though the air itself was choking her. She could feel the cold sweat on the back of her neck, the remnants of the nightmare still clinging to her skin. I don't know," Samantha finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was. I don't know what I thought. Everything feels strange." The nurse nodded sympathetically, as if she had heard this before. "That's perfectly normal, Samantha. You've been through a lot, and sometimes it takes a while for the mind to catch up with reality." Samantha tried to steady her breathing, forcing herself to focus on the nurse's words. But her mind kept drifting back to the darkness, to the cold, endless void that had swallowed her. It was too real to be just a dream. It couldn't have been a dream. "You've been asleep for a while," the nurse continued, her voice soft and comforting. "Your vitals are stable. You're going to be okay." Samantha nodded, but the unease didn't leave her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that she was still trapped, even though she was awake. Where was the creature? Why hadn't it come for her? The nurse took a step closer, reaching out to adjust the four in Samantha's arm. "We're just going to make sure you're comfortable. If you need anything, just let us know." Samantha watched her, the nurse's movements fluid and precise. But every time she looked at the woman's face, she saw a flicker of something behind her eyes, something unsettling. A shadow that didn't belong. She blinked, and it was gone, replaced by the soft smile of the nurse who had been nothing but kind to her. But Samantha couldn't shake the feeling. What if it wasn't just a nightmare? What if the darkness was still here, waiting for her? The nurse finished adjusting the four and stepped back, still smiling at her. "We'll give you some time to rest. Just call if you need anything." As the nurse turned to leave, Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She could have sworn she saw the woman's reflection in the window, a dark, twisted version of her, with hollow eyes and a grotesque smile. The figure in the window winked at her, before it vanished. Samantha's pulse quickened as she looked away, her eyes wide with panic. No, it couldn't be real. She had to be imagining things. It had to be the remnants of the nightmare still clinging to her, clouding her judgment. But deep down, a voice whispered, soft and sinister, in her ear, "You're still here." Samantha quickly turned her gaze to the window, but it was empty. The reflection had vanished, leaving only the soft glow of the morning light streaming through the glass. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She wasn't sure what was happening anymore. Was she still in the nightmare? Was she still trapped in that cursed world, or had she really escaped? She couldn't tell. But one thing was certain. Whatever she had faced in the darkness, whatever had tried to claim her, was still out there. And it wasn't done with her yet. The door closed behind the nurse, and the room was once again filled with silence. But in that silence, Samantha could hear something, faint whispers, almost imperceptible, coming from the corners of the room. "You can never escape," the voices murmured, as if they were echoing from the depths of the dark place she had left behind. Samantha's heart sank as she realized the truth. The darkness wasn't gone. It had followed her. And now, it was only a matter of time before it claimed her for good.